Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now, what about monetarists on monetary policy? First thing you want to understand is that monetarists are kind of a hybrid between the Keynesians and the classicals. They believe that the short run is important, like Keynesians do, and that during periods like the Great Depression, policy should have been more expansionary. Although the people that are most well known, like Milton Friedman, a real leader of the monetarist movement, are generally seen more in a classical light. They argued that most efforts of policymakers to smooth out the business cycle actually make things worse. In the case of discretionary monetary policy, there are lags, albeit shorter ones like there were for fiscal policy. Monetarists also believe there's a strong relationship between changes in the money supply and inflation, like classical theorists. However, they do not believe that velocity is constant, nor do they believe that output is constant. A little bit more about their positions. Monetarists believe the economy is self-regulating. Like classical theorists, prices and wages are flexible, and because of this, they believe that the economy will be self-regulating, that velocity changes in a predictable way, that aggregate demand depends on the money supply and velocity. So they argue that M and V can change aggregate demand. They say that the SRAS is upward sloping. This is a departure from the true classical theorists that believe it was vertical. That GDP will grow steadily if the money supply grows steadily. This is a real key piece because we're going to talk about activist versus non-activist monetary policy, and you would consider monetarists generally to be non-activists. They think that there needs to be a preset, rule-based approach for monetary policy, including a constant rate of money supply growth, like 3%. Changes in velocity in the money supply, they believe, will also change the price level and real GDP in the short run, but only the price level in the long run. So once again, bringing it back to an aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. In this exhibit, this illustrates some of these beliefs that monetarists have, showing the short run and the long run effects of changes in the money supply and velocity. In the short run, as we say, changes in the money supply, M, or velocity, V, will affect the price level, real GDP, and the unemployment rate, but in the long run, they will only change the price level since the economy is self-regulating. And some hypothetical numbers. So, for instance, you could use monetary policy to shift the AD curve to the right, and you would be in an inflationary gap in this example, but eventually the economy would self-regulate. Wages and prices are flexible. Monetarists believe, like their classical forefathers, so to speak, that it's going to shift back to the left. You could have a similar dynamic here with different figures, the same dynamic, but if you compare this one to the one above has a velocity of 3, so velocity is not changing in this example. In this example, velocity is changing, and the money supply is actually constant. So they're saying there's different ways to get to the same point in this example as well as in this example, starting in an inflationary gap already and then moving AD to the left and then having SRAS also adjust. That's why it's important to take a look at these figures in parentheses to see what part of the theory is being emphasized. So according to monetary policy, though, you could have a recessionary gap like this, and then SRAS could just do the work on its own. It can move to that point. However, because they believe in the short run, you can influence AD. You don't necessarily have to wait. So it's not always a bad news scenario. They're not saying don't ever use the money supply, don't use monetary policy, it's just ineffective. They're saying if it's done wisely, you don't have to wait for the long run, and you don't have to say well, we'll all be dead in the long run, and that's the best we can do as, classical theorists. We can, help stabilize the economy in the short run, but don't expect a long-term difference. Same would be true if you're in an inflationary gap. Sure, according to the beliefs of monetarists, the economy could, with wages and prices that are flexible, adjust itself, and you could have Sarras shift to the left and we get back to the long-run equilibrium, but we don't necessarily have to. If you have a decrease in the money supply, then ultimately what you're going to have is this chain reaction we've talked about before that will lead to a decrease in consumption and investment, and AD can shift now rather than waiting around.